Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to actually our only HSI Equity Talk for the 2024-2025 year. We do actually hope to have one more in June that we're just kind of putting together, but this is actually our first one. So my name is Charis Furzon. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as director of our HSI initiatives. So the HSI Equity Talks are intended to be a place for discussion on topics relevant to UC Santa Cruz as a Hispanic serving institution. So we seek to engage speakers from across the campus, and as we welcome attendees to engage in a critical dialogue with the content of the presentation of the talk. So together we try to unpack complex topics centered on the praxis of equity and servingness. So this talk has actually been kind of a long time in the making. Last fall, HSI and the Huerta Center connected for a UC Chicanx Latinx alumni event. And at that event, one idea that came from our Ghana's graduate director, Angel Dominguez, was a history of Latiné alumni and Latiné spaces on campus. Our then intern, Estefania Sanchez, made us a great walking tour for our alumni. And at that, we were connected with Jessica, and we had conversations, and Jessica shared about a project that she was going to be working with some undergraduate scholars on Latiné activism at UC Santa Cruz. So we said, this is an equity talk in the making. So today, we get to hear from our scholars about the histories of UCSC's Chicanx Latinx student activism. We're joined by undergraduate scholars Alex Santiago, Luis Garcia, Julian Serrano, Jamie Dye, and Dr. Jessica Taft. So Dr. Jessica Taft is a professor in Latin American and Latino Studies and is a faculty director of the Dolores Huerta Research Center for the Americas. Rooted in critical interdisciplinary approaches to child and youth studies, Dr. Taft's research focuses on young people's contribution to social change through activism and social movements in North and South America. So welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone.
It's really great to be here with you all. I thought I would start by doing a quick introduction of the Huerta Center. I hope everyone in this room and on Zoom is familiar with us, but in case not, it's always a good idea to remind people what the Huerta Center is and what we do. So the Huerta Center was founded in 1993 as the Chicano Latino Research Center, and it was at that moment the very first research center in the UC system to focus on Latin American and Latino studies. And one program, for the sort of sake of history and documentation, that's worth noting that kind of spun out of the Huerta Center was the Chicano Latino Undergraduate Support Program that is what became El Centro. So El Centro was actually birthed out of the research center that is now the Huerta Center. So we were renamed after Dolores Huerta just 3 years ago, so you might know us previously as the Chicano Latino Research Center, the Research Center for the Americas. And what we do is support research in the fields of Latin American and Latino studies, migration studies, human rights studies, social justice studies with a focus on the Americas. So we give graduate student research grants, we give faculty research grants, we support the publishing of research reports and more public-facing blog posts. You can find those on our website. They feature mostly research by our graduate students. We do small brown bag talks and conversations of faculty and graduate student research in progress, and we host a variety of public lectures. And then we also support the research and professional development for undergraduate students and are really committed to working with undergraduates in a variety of different ways. We have a legislative fellows program. Alex was one of our legislative fellows last year, where undergraduates are placed in California legislators' offices and supported by the Huerta Center in that process. And then we have a variety of research opportunities and programs that shift depending upon the sort of research interests of the faculty director, which rotates over time, and also what other research projects are happening on campus that we can plug undergraduate research apprentices into. So this project that we're going to talk about today is one of those kind of undergraduate research opportunities. The project started, as Chara says, with some conversations between myself and HSI initiatives and El Centro, thinking a little bit about the histories of Chicanx and Latinx, both students and student movements on our campus. And then I was teaching a class that I teach pretty regularly on Latin American and Latinx youth movements. I taught it last spring, and was thinking that it would be a really great opportunity to really focus in on movements here on our campus. So the whole focus of that class was really making sense of the history of Chicanx and Latinx student activism here at UCSC, and then using that to sort of reflect on the kind of broader literature and patterns and theories of the field as well. So students in that class did archival research. They used City on a Hill Press. They looked at the very old issues of Tuanas, which functioned much more as a kind of student newspaper, a particular student of color newspaper in its early years. They looked at the college and university archives and special collections, the various things that were in various boxes and files under the different kinds of papers from the different colleges. They read some already published oral histories. And then we reached out through LAN, the Alumni Network, to alumni with a kind of message that said, hey, we're interested in talking to Latiné alumni who were involved in student organizing and activism during their time on campus. We had a pretty great response. We got about 20 responses right away. We were only able to eventually schedule 9 interviews with those alumni, but we did 9 historical interviews with alumni from different time periods. And then the students in that class created a digital zine of the things that they learned, these different moments in UCSC's Chicanx Latinx student activist history. The QR code that you see there on your screen or behind me takes you to the zine. And so the zine is more kind of many stories compared to the stories that we're going to talk about today, but it was our sort of first output for kind of sharing this history and these narratives. They also created a whole set of This Day in History Instagram posts, and those This Day in History posts are sort of tagged to specific dates that have been significant here at UCSC, and we put those out on the Huerta Center Instagram feed. So it's like, on this day in history, 200 students occupied Han Student Services and made the following demands, right? So really trying to kind of bring that history to the present and to like make it sort of connect through those Instagram posts. And then what we've been doing this year, so that was all sort of in the context of the class, but we didn't feel like we were done, basically. So from there, what I've been doing this year, working with this team of 4 researchers who are all going to introduce themselves a little bit more in a bit, is going a little bit deeper into that history, right? In the context of a 10-week course, we can only do so much. So what we've been doing is kind of digging in to a couple of the really key cases, trying to get some more depth on some of our knowledge. We've also been exploring other ways to share these histories. So thinking about how do we make these histories of the kinds of forms of resistance, the ways that local Chicanx Latinx student activists have really transformed the institution, the role that they've had in creating many of the programs that we see today. So we've been trying to think about how do we interpret and insert this history into multiple kinds of contexts and places across campus. So one example of this that you'll hear about in a little bit is we're going to talk about the race and ethnicity GE requirement, which was the result of student organizing and activism. And like, what would it mean if the GE requirement on the website, where it talks about that GE requirement on the registrar's page or on the college pages, if it linked to a little paragraph that told you that this was the result of the organizing and activism of students of color that made this GE requirement happen. So thinking about these kinds of strategies for kind of dispersing, or I think as Louise called it, sprinkling this history more widely across campus is part of what we've been up to this year. And then another piece of what we've been doing is identifying some of the themes across the different cases. So trying to think across the different moments, across this history, what are some of the kind of recurring dynamics, recurring concerns, the kind of patterns over time. And so that's what we're going to sort of talk about today with the rest of our time. We really identified kind of 4 major themes in this kind of history of Chicanx Latinx student activism here at UCSC. The first is the fight for ethnic studies across the curriculum, and that includes demanding ethnic studies courses, ethnic studies in the colleges, ethnic studies as a GE requirement, and ethnic studies in departments. It also, so that's theme 1. Theme 2 is a whole variety of struggles around recruitment and support for a diverse faculty, staff, and student body. So thinking about what does that mean? What do we need on campus to actually recruit and create a context that is supportive of the wide variety of students and faculty and staff that might be represented by the state of California. The third theme is a recurring commitment of our Chicanx Latinx student activists to labor solidarity. And that's been labor solidarity both on campus and off campus. And you'll hear 2 examples of what some of that organizing has been. And then finally, immigrant rights work and immigrant justice work, again, both on campus and off campus. So we see the ways in which Chicanx Latinx student activists have linked their campus concerns with community concerns to bridge that divide at different times in different ways. And then the final theme that's not here, because we're not going to talk about it today, it's a little bit more kind of submersed, but we see it, is a kind of internationalist orientation, right? So work around anti-apartheid work in South Africa, anti-sweatshop work, Palestinian liberation work. So we see the sort of presence of these kind of internationalist themes in Chicanx Latinx student activism as well. So what we're going to do for the talk, basically for the rest of our time, is each of these folks is going to share with you some case studies from across these different 4 themes. And then I'm going to ask them a couple of questions about how doing this research has shifted or shifts their relationship to the institution. So part of our interest in this was thinking about what does it mean to know these histories? How does knowing these histories change how you think about what it is to be a UCSC student in the present? So we're going to talk a little bit about that together, and then we'll open it up for some questions for you all. So with that, I'm very happy to turn it over on this first theme of ethnic studies in the curriculum to Luis.
Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Luis Garcia and I'm a 4th year LALS major or Latin American Latino Studies major. And today I'm going to be talking about the fight for ethnic studies and the hunger strike at UCSC then and now. So in 1981, students from over 20 organizations came together to demand a third world and Native American studies program. And the petition of grievance made it clear that the curriculum was ignoring the third world perspective and that this wasn't just a problem just for students of color. And one student said specifically, an activist said that middle-class Americans should know more about the cultural background of third world studies to coexist peacefully in one society. So this was more about just classes, right? Students were fighting for recognition, students were fighting for representation, students were fighting for the truth, and they were fighting for the truth to be taught in the classroom. And so 24 students began a hunger strike. As you can see behind me, these are just screenshots of the video. If you guys want to look at the video, it's about a 25, 30-minute video on YouTube. It's posted on YouTube. It's called UCSC Hunger Strike. You guys can look at it whenever you guys want to. So these are just screenshots of something that I found interesting. This is just an example of a poster. Our struggles is in on many fonts. This is only one. So 24 students began a hunger strike, and it was led by Tuana's coalition, and it happened right here outside of McHenry Library. And the students gathered to share stories, they signed petitions, and they gathered to show, a lot of people gathered to show solidarity. And what stuck out to me the most, that there was a lot of singing and dancing and raw emotion in this video. And during that strike, Tuana said that they were not fasting for crumbs, and instead were fighting for structural change and meaningful support. So that level of commitment is hard to imagine, but it shows how serious the situation was, and students were literally putting their bodies on the line. So after 4 days, the pressure worked. UCSC agreed to the key demands like hiring professors in Asian American Studies, Native American Studies, and funding the Third World Teaching Research Center, which was at Merrill, and committing to ethnic studies in the curriculum. But the fight didn't end there. The ethnic studies GE requirement was one outcome of this long, very long struggle. And it wasn't everything Tuana's asked for, and it didn't lead right away to a department, but it was a step. And my research also included reading an interview with Professor Pedro Castillo. He was a historian, he was a Chicano historian who helped shape UCSC's response. And he shared how faculty struggled to agree on a full ethnic studies program. Some believe it was more urgent to hire faculty of color in departments like biology or history, just for example. So instead, they created an E requirement as a G requirement, and it was a compromise that covered broader non-Western racial ethnic perspectives. And as Castillo put it, it was not ethnic studies. And a lot of students pushed to make sure that the E requirement wasn't just a select departments, but it was included in the colleges as well. They knew how important it was to them, and they knew how important it was to make ethnic studies a part of the broader education for all students like myself, not just an optional add-on. But in 1984, students were pushing for real implementation, and this quote stuck out to me the most. One student activist said that the proposal has already been passed by the academic state. What we want now is implementation. So the reason why this quote stayed with me is because it reminds me specifically that activism doesn't end with the win, and it takes a lot of continued pressure and organizing. And these students didn't just change course requirements, they built a legacy in reality. And more than 20 years later, new generations of students like all of us here are still fighting for ethnic studies and for the creation of progress. And even now, the fight continues in different forms and different fonts. And yeah, that's my research on
that. On theme 2, recruiting and supporting a diverse faculty, staff, and student body, I heard from Jamie about the fight around Prop 209 and the occupation of Han.
Hi guys, I'm Jamie. I'm a third-year transfer student. I'm a sociology and critical race ethnic studies major here at UC Santa Cruz. So as Professor Taft said, I'll be talking about Prop 209. Prop 209 was a California proposition that passed in the 90s that intentionally targeted support and resources that went to marginalized and underrepresented communities. It was essentially an anti-affirmative action prop and tried to scrap all the progress of the civil rights movement. So UC Santa Cruz students have firmly rejected Prop 209 from the beginning and fought against its implementation on campus. In under 24 hours from the proposition passing, students organized and mobilized together, and that led to the occupation of the Hans Student Services Building. At this time, it housed the Student Affirmative Action and Educational Opportunities Program, which is now just EOP now. So around 300 students occupied the building for over 12 hours. They held a list of 15 demands to the chancellor and the administration to comply with. If you look at the QR code, you can scan it and see all the demands. It's pretty interesting. It goes beyond just the resource centers. It also does touch on ethnic studies and women's studies that the students demanded. But many of the student resources that we have on campus today are in legacy of the demands that were held by these students. Yeah, the chancellor and administration eventually complied with working together with these students. Some of the resources are Engaging Education, eSquare, the Ethnic Resource Centers, as well as other student services are in legacy to this activism. I personally was very moved learning about it because I know, I use the resource centers all the time. I know my success as a student is really in thanks to the students who fought for us. I feel like something interesting or funny to share that I learned in my research was one of the strategies that they used when police were trying to get up to the building is that they would just have students constantly going on the crosswalk so that cars couldn't get through. So they would just keep doing it back and forth until the police car finally honked at them and they're okay, go ahead. But they had that along the way to getting there. But yeah, I think the fight for equitable opportunities and student resources is still ongoing. I know there's a ballot right now for students to give more funds to the resource centers for students to vote for that. But yeah, I think in learning and doing this research, it was really important for me to understand that the university doesn't always just grant resources and services to the students. At the end of the day, it's always been the students and the people who have continued to fight for what they deserve. Yeah, that's my experience.
We're going to talk a little bit about labor rights and student worker solidarity. First, off campus with the Watsonville cannery strike. And Julian.
Right. Hi guys, my name is Julian Serrano. I am a fourth-year sociology student, and I'll be talking about the Watsonville cannery strike. So here we have a look at some powerful photos of the cannery strike. The strike started after workers' wages were cut from $7.06 to $4.43 an hour, and healthcare benefits were reduced. Chicana and Mexican women led the movement. About 90% of workers were Mexican and Latino, and 85% of said workers were women. UC Santa Cruz students joined in solidarity. On October 23rd, 1985, 100 UC Santa Cruz students marched to Waterville Canyon, but were blocked by police. Despite the court order limiting protests, 46 students continued and were cited. Hector Tobar, who is now a well-known author, shared that they weren't even allowed to make phone calls while they were waiting in holding cells. Even after the march, students kept showing up. They created committees to fundraise, spread the word, and offer legal help. Students from groups such as Mecha, Las Mujeres, Che, Frente Obrero Estudiantil, or FO for short, were right there supporting the cause. Some of the photos show police retaliation, officers blocking the picketers' paths, and arresting demonstrators on charges like fail to disperse. Another image causes us to remember the struggle when line workers were required to cut and pack 16 stalks of broccoli per minute, and anyone who couldn't keep up was let go. This highlights the intense and unforgiving working conditions faced by the workers. In 1988, to honor everything that had happened, over 100 UC Santa Cruz students came together to paint murals celebrating the workers' fights, and although the murals were later sent to city halls and the photos today are a little hard to find, they capture the spirit of resistance and community. Today, UC Santa Cruz is a Hispanic serving institution, but that didn't happen by accident. It's because of the sacrifices and the solidarities of those who came before us. As students, especially as first generation Latinx students, it's essential that we honor that history. The work, the risk, and the spirit of resistance that those workers and students showed is the foundation we stand on today. Personally, it's important to remember their fight, because by remembering their fight, we are not only respecting our roots, but we are also carrying their dreams forward.
Thanks, Julius. And now we've got Alex talking about the Jump Sodexo campaign.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex Santiago. I'm a second year studying politics and Latin American studies, and I'm the program and events intern for the Dolores Huerta Research Center. I'm also involved in the Worker Student Solidarity Coalition on campus, which made me have a particular interest in the Dump Sodexo campaign. So the Dump Sodexo campaign was part of a national push of a multi-year campaign to remove private prison food supplier Sodexo from campus. 50 of the 500 universities that Sodexo was providing at led protests to kick Sodexo off of campus, and it fell under different names. But essentially, it came at a time where people were recognizing the connections between financially supporting the prison private industrial complex and what role our dollar could play in terms of changing that. Students, and particularly Latino students, who had the capacity to communicate with the dining hall workers who were, predominantly Latino speaking Spanish, began to realize that not only the conditions were very poor at the dining halls, but also the wages were very poor. At that time, I believe it was quoted for it to be around $10 to $11 an hour for each hour of service in the dining halls, which, as many of you know, as all of you know, Santa Cruz has always been fairly expensive. And so that was certainly an unlivable wage, but didn't even compare to in-city rates in terms of wages. And so in students recognizing that this was unjust, but also feeding into a larger system that was oppressing their communities and their comrades, decided to make a change. Organizations including the Brown Berets, Students for Labor Against Privatization, SLAP, Mecha, and a coalition of Latino organizations decided to organize. They led walkouts, boycotting the dining halls, marches to the base of campus, but also engaged in some non-traditional action methods. They held conversations for students who maybe didn't understand why there was a move against Sodexo. They were playing a very active role in informing people of why Sodexo is obviously an immoral company that to be supporting, but also why workers deserved a living wage and benefits that allowed them to actually live in the city that they worked in, and gave respect for the jobs that they were doing. So this was happening throughout the early 2000s, but a lot of the peaks were happening between 2000 and 2003. In an SUA poll, 73% of students voted to discontinue partnership with Sodexo Marriott Services, which shows just how engaged students were in terms of understanding why Sodexo Marriott Services needed to be divested from. And ultimately, the contract ended on February 28th of 2003, which was a victory for students and workers at UCSC. An instrumental part of this was also that because the students were largely doing this for the workers who were being treated poorly, was that those workers would be put back in-house is the term, and retain their jobs, but with that livable wage and benefits. And they did this under AFSCME 3299. I'm currently a student organizing intern for AFSCME 3299. And it's important that they're unionized because obviously that guarantees them a bit better of a livable wage and benefits. But I can say certainly as a member of WISC and as an intern for AFSCME 3299, conditions are still poor on this campus, particularly Santa Cruz County is the most expensive county to live in the United States. So we're outpricing places like SF, LA. And this obviously reflects in terms of a lot of the workers have to move from 2 to 3 hours away, and the school charges them for van pool services. And obviously as an intern, I see this most directly. They're introducing arbitrary health increases against them, which takes hundreds of dollars out of their paycheck. And in terms of just conditions, I mean, the managers at the dining halls are very abusive, I would say, in terms of taking advantage of the workers, and the fact that they might not speak English the best, or that they come from a low-income background or a mixed status family. And I see the university taking advantage of that every single day. They're taking advantage of our workers. And so, I think Movie said a very good point. It doesn't end at getting unionized. That is a huge win in and of itself, but this work is definitely still continuing today. We're still in the middle of a contract fight. And so continuing that work and continuing that legacy has been very important to me, and learning and being able to research this campaign was very inspiring, because I got to see the work that students did generations before me. I got to see that they cared about the workers generations before me, largely people who look like me also, who come from a first-gen low-income background, who are able to understand that struggle. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about the Dumpster Exit campaign.
So for our last theme, we have 3 different examples of immigrant justice organizing, both on and off campus. We're going to circle back around to Jamie on one of the other propositions in the 90s, Prop 187. Jamie's our proposition expert.
I don't know about that. So Prop 187 was another California proposition that passed in 1994, just 2 years before 2009. It was called the Save Our State proposition, but it was essentially an anti-immigrant California proposition. It scapegoated immigrants as the cause for California's problems, which is something we're also seeing today in general. But the proposition prohibited undocumented immigrants from having access to public and social services. So this included public education, non-emergency healthcare, and various other services. UC Santa Cruz students were very much against it. Even the chancellor criticized the proposition. However, they were unsure about committing to the implementation or against implementation on campus. So that made students push more efforts to educate other students about the prop and resisting its implementation on campus. I'll talk about 3 actions that happened. The day after the election, when the proposition passed, over 800 Santa Cruz community members staged a walkout that blocked traffic on Highway 1 for over 4 hours. It included UCSC students, it included local high school students, other local residents, and particularly residents from the Beach Flats area, which is a predominantly Latino area. But yeah, that firmly demonstrated the opposition of the community to 187 on campus. Another significant action was they actually also held hunger strikes between February 16th to 18th in 1995. Around 40-ish students participated in this method of nonviolent protest. And something interesting was that they did clearly link their struggle to what Luis talked about ethnic studies and their hunger strike. And even today, we do see students across college campuses doing a hunger strike again for what's happening in Palestine. So it's interesting to see the links between the different struggles. Students also boycotted Bay Tree Bookstore because they had Nabisco products, and they demanded the removal of them because Nabisco was funding Republican politicians who were pushing for Prop 187. Prop 187 eventually was deemed unconstitutional in 1999, and it very much had a lasting impact on the Latino community in California. People say that like it united the Latino community, and there was a huge shift of voters into the Democratic Party in California. At UCSC, I have a lot of the Tanas pictures. There were like many articles and many full volumes that were just dedicated to talking about Prop 187. It was really interesting to see all the art and see all the different things that students had to say. And yeah, that was my part on Prop 187.
Bounce back to Alex on the Day Without Immigrants from 2006.
Day Without Immigrants was again part of a national push to support immigrant and undocumented communities within the United States. Around this time in 2006, around this time as in, sorry, I don't know what I meant by that. HR 4437 was introduced, where the Border Protection, Anti-Terrorism, and Illegal Immigration Control Act of 2005. This was actually a bipartisan push, although it was led by conservatives predominantly, which targeted and demonized undocumented immigrants in the United States. Nationally, actions were happening as it had already passed in the House, and people were recognizing that this was obviously an unfair portrayal of the community members that were not only running the United States in a large way, but unfairly demonizing families and communities, particularly in Santa Cruz, where our neighbors are Watsonville and Salinas, predominantly Latino communities, but as well as a large community within Santa Cruz. This was recognized, and students decided to mobilize. Students including the Brown Berets, students in Corminal, Racine, Mecha, and other organizations mobilized and led protests as well to the base of campus to demonstrate their support for the undocumented and immigrant community, also keeping in mind that a lot of the acts that were protecting or supporting undocumented students didn't exist at this point in time. I'm forgetting, I think it's AB 540, did not exist, and so a lot of undocumented students were paying out-of-state tuition, and the same support structures once again did not exist. And on March 16th or 17th of 2006, over 500 people protested and gathered in front of the the county building in Santa Cruz to demonstrate their support. And ultimately, HR 4437 did not pass the Senate because of this national outcry that happened beyond Santa Cruz, thankfully. But it was also a wake-up call for members of the community of how we could better support undocumented people, undocumented students, and how integral they were to the community.
Alex. To close us out, we've got one more, something on undocumented student organizing. Juliet.
Right, so as we have heard today, undocumented student activism at UC Santa Cruz has been persistent and powerful for almost 2 decades. In 2005, AB 540, as I was mentioned, and undocumented students created Students Informing Now, SIN, to establish a community of mutual support and advocacy. Assembly Bill 540 is important because it allows undocumented and other eligible students access to in-state tuition rates for California public institutions, so they won't have to be paying out-of-state rates. These students have massive barriers such as no access to federal financial aid, social isolation, and ongoing fear of deportation and limited student services, as well as university services. SIN was born from the protest against institutional abandonment and cultural erasure. Their slogan, Sin Vergüenza, or without shame, expressed their determination to vocalize what they had endured. In 2008, SIN held Voces Sin Vergüenzas, a public testimony performance in which students delivered deeply personal narratives about migration, trauma, resilience, and love. Described as a necessity to heal, this performance transformed individual sufferings into public resilience, challenging UC Santa Cruz and its community to confront the reality of undocumented students' lives. In 2003, SIN protested against the appointment of Janet Napolitano as UC president. Former Secretary of Homeland Security, Napolitano had overseen the deportation of over 2 million people. Her appointment caused fear and outrage, particularly in the case of undocumented students who had already experienced the impact of her actions. SIN organized rallies, walkouts, and banner drops demanding protections and justice for undocumented students in the UC system. In 2025, around 200 students and allies mobilized across UC Santa Cruz demanding housing protections, mental health services, and undocumented student services in each fixed location. Students joined graduate student labor strikes, pointing out the economic affinities between undocumented students. The scene's impact went beyond individual members. They established strong alliances with AFSME, as Alex mentioned earlier, union organizers, racial justice advocates, queer and trans student organizations, and academic departments. These coalitions highlighted how undocumented students experience compounded oppression due to class, race, gender, and sexuality. Their activism led to actual institutional change. UC Santa Cruz established support services, emergency grants, legal rights workshops, and scholarships for undocumented students. Training programs for faculty and staff were developed, creating a more informed and compassionate campus culture. Undocumented student activism at UC Santa Cruz is a legacy of courage and transformation. It is a reminder that those who fought for their voice to be heard can transform institutions, and that future students stand on the foundation of their struggles.
Now I'm gonna go back to the beginning, just so folks have the big picture there. It's really great to hear all of the sort of specific pieces and the research. We talked about, I've got a couple of sort of reflection questions that are some things that we've talked about, like what does it mean to have done this research? And so we're just gonna riff on those for a little bit and then we'll open it up for you all. So my first question for everybody basically is that, right, one of the outcomes people who look at racial equity in higher education talk about is this idea of sense of belonging, right? Students who experience a greater sense of belonging at an institution are more likely to stay enrolled, to graduate, to have better mental health overall, to be involved in a variety of activities that build non-academic skills and knowledge. But this concept of sense of belonging doesn't always distinguish between the various things people might feel belonging to, right? Like what belonging to what within an institution. So I wonder if you all might say something about how this research has impacted your own belongingness here at UCSC, or how knowing this history may change how you think about what it is you belong to, or what it means to belong at UCSC. Whoever wants to start.
I could go first.
Yeah.
So for me personally, I felt like I didn't belong in such an institution, high institution, just due to my background. I'm from San Bernardino's, SoCal. It's arguably one of the most dangerous cities in California. So you just become accustomed to the gang violence and just everything that's going on over there. And I think when it came to this research, it gave me a sense of belonging, because the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing today and what I'm studying, which is LALS, Latin American Latino Studies, it gave me a sense of belonging because it made me understand that like students of color here at UCSC have always fought for what they believed in because they believed it was right. And that's something that everyone should learn. And I think then the university doesn't naturally provide a sense of belonging, so students had to do that, had to provide a sense of belonging when it comes to the community or just anything like that. So I feel like, so students built that through coalitions, through community, through direct actions, and they made the university listen. So because of that and because of this research, I feel like my sense of belonging is activism, is with the Research Center, it's with activists and students like people here, you know. So I feel like this research, specifically this program, gave me a sense of belonging, and it makes me more confident to be in school, because I wasn't always confident in school. So I think that's my answer.
Go ahead.
I feel like we talked briefly about this question before, and it really puzzled me a bit because I feel like I struggle to feel a sense of belonging to the university, knowing what the university has done to students and how it works. And doing the research, I feel like I got connected and feel a sense of belonging way more to the students, as we said, belonging to the struggle of students and like the legacy of the activism that students have fought for. Yeah, I feel a sense of belonging to students here, but in terms of to the university, it's still like an iffy relationship. I don't know how I would call that if I belong and feel a part of the university. So yeah, that's why I'm still figuring that out.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I think the greatest spaces where I've seen this like quote unquote like belonging being built, as I think the university would define it in terms of finding a community, have always been student-led spaces. And I think this research has like affirmed my understanding of that has always been how it is, unfortunately. Like you said, like all of these resource centers, things that have now been institutionalized, were still student initiated efforts. And I think as a student who spends a lot of my time building this quote unquote belonging for the university and has at times felt a lot of frustration for how the university responds to that or how it neglects to allocate funding, allocate time, allocate resources to that, but continues to build its institutional image off of that belonging, has always been something that's very frustrating to me. I think, especially with, I don't know, it's cool to like connect the labor aspect especially, because I don't know, I think we're both groups that, especially like with like the Latino students connecting with like Latino workers, I think it's important to recognize that like we are the ones who are gonna ultimately look after our own community. At the end of the day, the university is not gonna be the one that comes in, no matter how much it would like to claim it is, especially now as it is actively defunding, you know, a lot of the resource centers that these students rely on. It's very, even the measure that's being introduced in the SUA this year is for students to add on an extra fee so that the resource centers will be funded. And so as it continues to proclaim on all of its newsletters, why don't you, like, I don't know, it's always been such a dichotomy for me, and it definitely cemented my understanding of, oh, this is actually how this functions, which is frustrating, but I don't know. I guess it's how it's going to continue to be. So. And I get a lot of enjoyment from building belonging and stuff like that. But yeah, I can't even think of like the number of things that students here do to continue this advocacy, but also to continue. They do tours for, you know, predominantly Latino schools. They have mentorship. We do all of these things. That takes so much time and effort when we're usually the ones struggling the most at this institution in terms of the unaffordability, the inaccessibility of classrooms. And so, students deserve a lot of credit, I think, for doing all that work.
Shirley, you want to add anything about belonging?
Yeah, I think it always catches me off guard whenever I think of belonging in Santa Cruz, because not only, again, as we mentioned, I'm also from SoCal, from Orange County. It's like a different culture, a different environment for sure. And constantly having to remind myself that UC Santa Cruz is a Hispanic serving institution when it doesn't really feel like it. It just reminds me that like I have to be here for those that came before me so that their efforts don't get wasted, so that the programs that they've established aren't like shut off because they're not used enough. So I think that's where I build my sense of belonging, like going to student-led stuff.
Yeah, a lot of putting on there, I think, like these themes of the importance of the student-led spaces, the importance of thinking about how knowing the history reminds you of the importance of the student-led spaces, and that like one can belong to a legacy of students, even if the institution continues to feel like it's not meeting your needs, right? But that there's like deep frustration there at the amount of work that takes too. So yeah, there's a lot of important insights in all of that. My other question for you all, right, is one of our goals has been to try to make this history more visible across campus. So, anyone want to give me a concrete example of something we've learned about or something from one of our case studies and say how you think knowing that specific piece of student activist history might impact other students? Knowing that a particular thing was the result of student struggle.
I think one thing that comes to mind, Alex actually coordinated an event. It's called UC Student Activism. We went to San Francisco, and there was like 15 to 20 students. There was about 20 students that signed up, and we all went to San Francisco. We were just talking about what we could do better as a community, and what are their thoughts, and like any other forms of activism, right? And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I presented a part of the digital zine, and when I asked them if anyone knew about any like the hunger strike or the Han student, when the students took over the Han student building, all 20 students said that they did not know anything that happened here at UCSC. So I took that as an opportunity to educate all of them, and that's when I also told them that this program also does the This Day in History. And that's when all 20 students followed the Instagram page and was educating themselves on topics like what we're talking about today. So I think that's something that I guess we're trying to sprinkle everywhere, like what Professor Taft said earlier, because they didn't know, but they're willing to understand, and they're willing to understand. How do I say this? Like, they're willing to understand, and they want to do something about it too. So like after I presented this, the research, about like 45 students were talking to me on the side. It was like, hey, like, what else do you do? Like, how can I be a part of this? It's like, can I volunteer? And it made me happy, because it's like something that's something that activism does. Like, one thing that comes to my mind is that activism is something that you have to be loud for, you have to be in the front of the lines with the megaphone or something, but this is something that I'm not used to, right? And I feel like this is a form of activism, doing research and behind the lines, and just trying to advocate and just educate people. And I think that's one reason, or one example of what came to mind, and what something that Alex coordinator said.
Yeah, I think Luis's presentation was one of the biggest highlights in the entire student activist retreat. So many students talked about it on the feedback form, and a quote that I'm vaguely remembering, paraphrasing right now, I'll say, was about the importance of keeping archives and the importance of keeping our history alive, because for, intentional means, such as the university liking to claim why these institutions and why these different programs exist for students, to it just simply disappearing over time because it's not being maintained, was really important for students to see, especially because that was a student activist retreat. A lot of people who were doing the groundwork for Ideas, for El Movimiento, for Tuanas, actually, students who were parts of these organizations had never seen it prior to that, which was very, very sad, honestly, in a lot of regards, because I think that's another power dynamic for how this university keeps its strength. This university has impeccable archives of all the things that they've done and how they've behaved over time, and they train each other for decades, and bring up these professionals, right, to lead the UCSC administration. And we are only here for 2 or 4 years, 2 years if you're a transfer student. But we do very important work in a very short amount of time oftentimes. But how we strengthen those movements is by continuing to learn and build off of the ones prior that came before us. And so yeah, I think it was really cool to see student activists, reinforce their own histories with what Luis was displaying to them and what students had worked on and produced.
Do you want to add on this one? Something it's useful about learning this history for other folks, do you think?
Yeah, I can add. I feel like, especially Alex and I talked about like the research centers, how students are having to choose whether to vote to fund these research centers, but it's something that they have to pay for. When the university, I feel like, the tours, they'll talk about all these resource centers that we have and everything, but why is it that students are the ones that had to fight for it and now they're continuing to be the ones to fund it now? It's important to really thinking to what Luis said about not always being on the front line. I think mobilizing and direct actions are only such a small part of being like a student activist. I think a lot of the work is just talking and communicating with one another and like spreading those things, like integrating it into my conversations. And we're talking about what things you're gonna vote for on the ballot and like adding those little things that you know from the research. And I think those are really important to acknowledge that about the resource center.
Something that comes to mind when Alex talked about the don'ts there. So, campaign is how I think a lot of the time students aren't aware of who's actually working on our dining halls because academic university is just like, oh yeah, we hired these people, we went out of our way to do this, when it's actually not the full story. And I think it's important that students kind of are aware of that because even now we're still fighting to make sure that they have fair pay and fair wages. So I think that's something that would be beneficial for students to learn a little bit more about.
Yeah, I think, right, there's like some value in both knowing the history because you know how the things got there and you can then sort of appreciate them, use them, make sure you're taking advantage of them. There's some things about like knowing that it was students who fought for it that might change your relationship to it a little bit, to see it as student-led rather than as institutional in a certain way. And just the ways that sort of knowing, also I think knowing that student movements have won some things, right? I think in this particular moment, there's a real challenge around feeling like activism wins, that it gets things. But I think we have from all of these stories, all of these amazing examples of things that our Chicanx Latinx student activists have created and won and gotten, right? And that I think is always an important reminder that like the things that we have that we love and appreciate are often the result of struggle, and those struggles didn't always know that they were going to win either, right? So there's something about that reminder of the victories that I think might be important.